Welcome back, everybody. It is an honor to have Gene Epstein on the podcast once again with the fresh Kobayashi painting behind him. I told him I'm not bringing you on until you got some nice artwork in that office, and it's an honor to have you here, Gene.
Yeah. Rob, and Kobayashi is the last name of my wife, Sako Kobayashi, who's a world-class abstract painter. And so thanks for the plug. Paintings like that go for about 5,000 in shitcoin, but for run your mouth regulars, I probably could negotiate a 20% discount. Can you afford not to buy a Kobayashi, given what's likely to happen to the stock market, the bond market? Kobayashis and Bitcoin are probably where you should put your shitcoin. That's my slogan. And thanks for allowing me to put in that plug, Rob. I've got a couple of other plugs, but mostly, of course, I want to say it's great to appear once again on Run Your Mouth with Professor Rob Bernstein, because I especially like your style. I like the way you listen and then you summarize and you say, did I get that right? You know, and in an age of short attention spans, you sometimes have to repeat things. And especially given what we're going to discuss today, which is money, banking, fascinating and important issues, but a little complicated. So we want to unpack them slowly. And I'm going to do that this afternoon. But let me begin with a plug of my own, because, you know, these podcasts go on for a couple of hours and who knows who's listening at the end. So let me just put my front load my plug, Rob, about what I'm up to. On Friday evening, May 28th, I'm going to be in the Free State of New Hampshire, and that kicks off Memorial Day weekend in the Free State of New Hampshire. There are going to be a lot of great events up there, a lot of nice hotels to stay at. My wife Asako and I are going to be there through the weekend. Dennis Pratt, who organizes Pork Fest, for example, is going to have a reception at his lovely home and lawn on Sunday evening. There's going to be a couple of events at the Shell, which is where they meet. And Friday evening, I'm going to be at the Shell. That's May 28th. The audience is going to watch my recent April 18th debate on socialism versus capitalism with Ben Burgess. And Ben, those who listen to Dave Smith's show, for example, are pretty familiar with Ben Burgess. Of the three debates I've had on socialism, I've now had a socialist trilogy. Ben put up the biggest fight of all, I will certainly say. I was fully expecting that. I did win pretty substantially, according to Oxford-style voting, as I also suspected. And Ben, I think, very nicely exposed the kind of dystopia he wants for us all in under socialism. But the question is, how well did I ultimately do? Socialism is not dying. They're still out there preaching this dystopian gospel, and I'm going to be interested in feedback. We're going to watch the show, and then I'm going to be put in the hot seat by the audience. They're going to say, what else could you have said? What else could you have done? Where does all this stuff come from? I think it'll be a fascinating evening on May 28th. Go into my Twitter account at Gene Soul Forum for full information, or go into our website, thesoulforum.org, for information about that Memorial Day weekend in the Free State of New Hampshire, which I'll be kicking off with a Gene Epstein in the hot seat evening at the Shell, their meeting place, on May 28th.
It's a fun venue. I went up there last year, December, and I can tell you those guys are pretty knowledgeable. So I hope that they, I bet they'll have some good insights for you, and it's going to be a fun event.
I always have room for improvement, even at 76, Rob. At age 76, I've learned a lot from you, from Dave, from Tom Woods, from even occasionally from Ben Burgess, although very rarely. And so I'm going to benefit, and I think it'll be an electric evening. We will record it. We will record it on video and audio, and release it to the world as well. So you won't, you'll be able to benefit from it as well, even if you can't make it.
Excellent. So today I invited you back on because since we last spoke, I've been reading Rothbards. I got it here. This time I won't mess up the title. We got a history of money and of banking in the United States. It's a dense
nothing
read.
You won't read, Rob. God, I don't know That's a very dense work. Yes, going yeah. It's actually it's a potpourri. It's a collection of different essays that Rothbard wrote. Yeah.
Oh, okay. It's a dense read. To me, this is the most interesting topic where if you were just to kind of, if you've ever watched a movie like Ocean's 11, where there's this amazing grift and they're stealing from the casino, to me, the story of the Federal Reserve is not that dissimilar, where you've got the most incredible con of all time, where everybody just accepts that there's this institution basically run by private banks that are profiting by printing money and lending it out. And there's a expansionary, inflationary scheme that we're going to start to break down for you. But that in the overall is why I find this so interesting, is that right before us, we've got this incredible con. So before we get into some of the book, Gene, you said that you were going to give us kind of the Austrian take about firstly the origins of money, and then we'll start getting into the fundamental reason of why we just be better off with the private banking apparatus, why we don't need this federal banking or, the money reserve system. So I'll hand it back to you to start educating us here.
Yeah. Well, again, I have to caution Rob Bernstein's listeners. I don't know who you are, but Rob Bernstein is just an incredible scholar. He just loves historical minutia. This is a very dense book. Occasionally, it even confused me because it throws so many concepts around. But that's Rob for you. He's the ultimate Talmudic scholar. God knows what, probably 100 years ago, he would have been a famous rabbi and an expert on almost all the Talmud, because that's Rob's mind. But those of us who don't share the density of those gray furrows in Rob's brain have to approach this thing a little bit more simply. Is that a train in the background, Rob? What's going on?
I do live next to a train station, which is good for my property value. That's how I can afford such a nice room like this, is that fine train sound.
You're in the Bronx, Rob?
No, I live in Connecticut, but still next to a train station. I try I'm used to New York City sound, so I made sure before I moved here that there'd be a lot of noise.
Yeah. Well, okay. I'm going to proceed with what comes mostly from Rothbard, although surprisingly enough, I'm going to be weaving some insights from free market antagonists of Rothbard, George Selgin and Larry White. George Selgin is at Cato Institute, and Larry White is at George Mason. They are fellow travelers, and they do have insights, and that will come up as well. But basically, I have made a 50-year study of the subject, and for the most part, what I know, I got from Rothbard. I want to begin then with the simplest question of all, which is the origin of money, which is actually the same topic as why do we value money? When we receive dollars, what is the mechanism whereby we place value on those dollars? Now, that may seem almost an irrelevant question, but really it is a question that economists must ask. And the Austrians, starting with Karl Menger, had a unique answer to that question. And unfortunately, you will not find the Austrian answer in any of the textbooks. You'll find a lot of mathematical gobbledygook about how we value money. It's called the Regression Theorem. I think that's what Mises called it. I myself would like to just call it more colloquially the yesterday theory. Really, we are all very simple folk. And if Rob receives $100 in shitcoin, $100, then he values it. I value it. Anybody values it based upon our knowledge about what it could buy yesterday. That's basically it. That sort of elementary explanation is what you have to begin with. We knew it could buy a certain amount of goods and services yesterday. And we're pretty accurate to imagine that for the most part, it's going to buy a similar basket today. We even know, of course, that prices change a little bit from day to day. We might be subject to a shock here and there, but by and large, we value the money. We accept those dollars, those greenbacks, or that check drawn on a bank, which is part of the Federal Reserve System. We accept it because we knew it could buy things yesterday. But now the question regresses backward in time. why did we value that money yesterday? Well, because we knew it could buy things the day before. And that's where we keep going back and back in time. It could buy things the day before, the day before that, the day before that. And in fact, historically, we know that the dollar traces itself to gold and silver. That we know back in the 19th century that the dollar was redeemable in gold and to some degree redeemable in silver. And so we know then that the dollar's value was piggybacked on gold, that gradually the government phased out the redeemability, but then it depended on accepting the idea that it could buy things the day before. So now we begin to talk about gold and silver. And then we begin to then ask another question, a related question. If we're going to keep going back and back in time with these dollars or with this gold and silver, and we're going to say, well, we value it because of what it could buy the day before that, and the day before that, we know that at some point in time, we're at day zero. We're at day zero before money came into being. We know that humankind was on this earth for many millennia prior to the use of money. So what was the case on day zero? And this is, of course, the Mengerian and Misesian solution, which says that all money must begin. I'm going to take some cough medicine. All money must begin on the free market in some commodity or other. That gold and silver being a very, very good examples, but seashells were also money. Salt was money. In other words, what happened now, if we go back in time and start going forward, is that in order to facilitate the trading of goods, people began to think, well, I've got eggs and Rob has ham, and I don't really want to. Rob doesn't want my eggs, and I don't want his ham. But if I give him some commodity that he values, that he might be able to trade for something else, then maybe we could arrange a transaction. And so that's where you might hit on gold and silver. Perhaps you know the famous story about the British POW camp during World War II. They got care packages, and a lot of different, care packages, which is set series of goods, and different people wanted different things in different care packages, but they couldn't trade the particular items in the care packages. So suddenly they were using cigarettes as their medium of exchange, because everybody smoked, or almost everybody, or even if you didn't smoke, you knew that cigarettes were of value. So money is a medium of exchange, and it always begins in a commodity, and it always begins then on the free market. Government does not create money. It's only created on the free market. As we regress back in time, it always originates in a commodity. And then if you think about the use of cigarettes as money versus the use of gold, you have to recognize, well, in the POW camp, all they had was cigarettes. So that was what was the easiest thing to use as money. But certainly if they had access to gold, they would have used gold trinkets, because the cigarettes wear out. You can the gold is much more easily assayable. The gold is the gold, it can be transported in valuable small units. The other part of it as well is, which probably I assume is true of cigarettes, is that gold is expensive to mine. And that it's very difficult. You can have a gold mine, but still it costs money, it costs time, it costs effort, and therefore the amount of gold outstanding can only be increased by a certain amount, by a limited amount. It's factually true that even given some of the famous gold finds of the 19th century, did not really cause a whole lot of price inflation, did not really increase the amount of gold outstanding by very much. And now, of course, almost all the gold outstanding today is equivalent to all the gold that's actually been mined since the beginning of time. So I'm emphasizing gold because gold became the money of choice. But so the point is the lesson in this. Go ahead, Rob.
No, I was going to say this is somewhat a fascinating way to think about money, and I never thought about it on these terms. But money is almost the first invention of the free market. Like when we think about the free market and it comes up with solutions because people are engaging and like they're solving problems. So money solved the problem of what if I want that from you and I don't have something that I can trade for it, or we got expiring goods. So in other words, money came about because people organically solved the store of value problem, and they saw the need to have a third, like almost like a third party item that you could trade for goods, such as cigarettes within a, prison type environment. And so money is like, it's one of the initial things that the market was able to solve. It was a problem that was solved by the market, that we could have this other thing that we could use as a vehicle for trade. And that's the origin of money.
Yes. Although I want to correct, you use the term store of value, which I want to discuss. You actually mean facilitate exchange, the exchange of goods, the mismatch of goods and services that we trade. Rothbard used to joke, to buy a newspaper in the morning, I could offer an economics lecture to the guy who runs the newsstand, but unfortunately that's not going to go if I offer him some money. So it's exchange. The store of value aspect of it, which is very much in the language, is interesting to explore. Maybe we could explore that in a moment, but we're really talking about exchange, the exchange of goods and services, which then facilitates the division of labor. And that's the problem itself. And then also the other point to bear in mind then is that there's no way for government to suddenly declare that money exists. Government can only intervene and piggyback on the chain of gold, silver that already exists. Government does not create money. Only can money be created from a commodity, and then as that commodity becomes into greater use, then the day before that begins to become the dynamic. And again, at day zero, it was a commodity and it had value, and so that's how the monetary regime got off the
So I do have a question on that, though. The origin of what you described was that money, I'm piggybacking that in my head, it had value yesterday, right? With the government money, though, part of what gives money value is that I know for sure that I can spend it somewhere. I expect that it's going to continue to have value. If government were to create a new currency tomorrow and say, hey, this currency is good for paying your taxes, then I know that there's built-in redeemability for it. So like, even if, the origin of our system that you had stated was that money came originally, it was backed by gold and silver. And you were saying essentially they were piggybacking this process of the organic money creation. But I would think that if a new government were to, be formed tomorrow and they said, hey, we will accept the following for your taxes, then there would probably have some built-in value, because I know at a minimum I can use it to pay off the government. So any store theoretically might accept it because they also know that at the end of the day, it's got redeemability at the government. It has a built-in usage, which to me is part of the value of even, our greenback today.
Well, yes. But by analogy, we used to have subway tokens, when we rode the subway. Now, of course, we have subway cards. There were American Express cash, the private sector, you could redeem it in cash, but these are American Express. Why am I forgetting the term? You could create sort of a subset of money. As I say, the subway tokens were probably a decent. Stamps, for example. I will tell you that in my childhood, they said you could send stamps, you could send money, or you could send 50 cents worth of stamps, and that would be usable as money. So you could create, and as you say, well, if the government is collecting $1 trillion a year, and it issues these tokens, I guess. Well, let's see, how would it work? I have to think about it. We have to buy stamps with money. That's standard money. We had to buy subway tokens with money. So the government issues these tokens. Elaborate on that. We buy them with money. We buy them with regular money, then, don't we, Rob? How do we acquire these tokens that the government issues with which it could pay taxes? What does it do? It just how do we get it in the first place? Stumped you, Rob.
No, so I guess the redeemability would be I guess at the origin of the government's creation of a new currency that would be redeemable for taxes is something that they would have to set a
It
price
creates
for
a currency.
and spend.
It puts it in the. I mean, because I'm just doing the analogy with the use. Literally did happen.
Right.
It was not uncommon where they could say send $1 worth of stamps and that's acceptable as money. But you have to buy the money. You have to buy those stamps with money. So the government is issuing it. How? Let me see. I guess it could pay its employees when the government. Yeah. Well, I guess when the government contracts with vendors, or when it buys the services of its civil service employees, it could issue these tokens. Yeah,
as a theoretical, the SDR is not that different from what we're describing, that because governments were willing to accept it, you kind of have a new currency that wasn't at its origin backed by gold or silver.
Well, yes. Well, I mean, it certainly wasn't that as well. I guess, by the way, Rob, that might segue into a discussion of Bitcoin, because Bitcoin didn't have the same origin. I'm only saying that I guess I do want to address your point about the taxes, because a lot of economists seem to sort of throw this around that's why it's money, because government accepts it for taxes. I get the only point I guess is that bear in mind that hopefully we will still have a lot of capitalism, and hopefully the government will only take 30% of the economy. So therefore, if we pay it taxes, then 70% of our transactions will still be capitalist transactions. It will still be purchasing goods and services, and so government use of these tokens, just like tokens to get on the subway, or just like the use of stamps, is going to be an aspect of what we do. But the SDRs don't dominate either, and so I don't see that government can take over completely because it can't. It can only issue these things through the purchase of services from vendors, or it could issue these things through the purchase of services from its civil service. Although probably what would happen, Rob, is that if you let's say you and I have wonderful sinecures working for the Defense Department, and we get paid in money in these tokens that can pay our taxes, we'll probably convert most of it to actual regular money in order to transact in the free market. Probably it's not going to dominate. It seems unlikely. As a matter of fact, this gives I mean, you raise some issues that are rough around the edges, none of which subverts the idea that this is where money comes from. But I did want to mention something of great interest, which relates to the point you raised. There are a group of people who associate themselves with the MMTers, the modern monetary. I call them so often theorists.
Yeah,
I tend to call them it modern monetary tyranny. And so
all right.
I keep forgetting what the T stands for. It stands for there. Yeah, and so there are these crazy theorists who actually argue that government issued money in the first place, that my history is wrong, the regression theorem is wrong, and what they like to cite is that government was indeed issuing gold and silver coins pretty early on, and that we don't by the way, we don't have any snapshots, we don't have any real stories about Rob Bernstein's ancestor who bought something from Gene Epstein's ancestor. Probably the Jews were the ones who thought of it first, Rob, as they often do. And so we don't really have any historical anecdotes which say, it was actually 11,000 BC when Rob Bernstein's ancestor first used a little bit of gold to buy something from Gene Epstein's ancestor. So we actually don't have.
To state what I was saying maybe a little bit differently is we're still. Tomorrow, if government were to create a currency, it's still piggybacking a system in which they were able to move from gold and silver over to paper dollars. Yeah. And so now there might be more of a buy-in aspect of that, because they've already created an entire banking apparatus that works off of government fiat currency. So they might be able to do that. Your point, though, is just that the origin of currency and people transacting in some sort of a third, let's just call it a third party device, not just my eggs for your chicken, but my gold for your chicken, originates from people outside of government wanting to transact. It grew organically from a human need for transactions, and government over time was able to piggyback that process by building off of what was already existing with gold and silver.
Yes, yeah, and okay, I was going to tell the story which actually they're trying to claim that government actually created gold and silver as money, because they issued gold and silver coins, and it was Larry White who pointed out that if government did this, then they wouldn't have used gold and silver. They would have used cheaper items. If government actually created money, because gold and silver is preferred on the free market precisely because it's scarce and expensive. Government would have used a cheaper method. But that's a digression. But of course that sets the stage for the next part of it. I guess let me digress for a moment to use a nice analogy that George Selgin uses when he points out that the mainstream, because they've learned it from Adam Smith, the mainstream favors free international trade. And when the mainstream criticizes tariffs and other trade barriers, they have in their mind an understanding of how free international trade would actually work. They have such concepts of comparative advantage, which I prefer to call relative advantage, because it's often confused. They understand what free trade is. But Selgin points out the mainstream, however, doesn't have a clue, or even though it's been handed to them by the Austrians, does not have a clue about how a free market in banking would work. And so, and of course, the Federal Reserve offers them great opportunities for power and wealth and influence. And so they're seduced by the Federal Reserve. So when you confront in a textbook is when you're discussing money and banking, suddenly the central bank is part of the firmament. It's like a given. We never question it. But obviously the story that we've just told then asks, why does government get involved at all in money? And of course, we know to fight its wars and to finance itself. Government has normally two ways to raise money, through taxing and borrowing. But a third way would be to be able to print money. And in order to print money, you have to seize the people's money. And so that's what motivates government to get involved. And why I call MMT modern monetary tyranny is that at least if we're going to have a government, if the government wants the fruit of our labor, if it wants to take our resources, let it come to us and say, we're going to tax you or we're going to borrow. And of course, if we borrow, we've got to borrow against future taxes. At least put that limitation on government's power. But the MMTers say, oh God, that's so arcane. That's just so passé. All government has to do is print the money. And of course, that's what the Federal Reserve allows the government to do. And that's what other institutions prior to the Federal Reserve allow the government to do. And why I call it tyranny is that's when it doesn't even have to ask us about taking the fruit of our labor. It can simply preempt us by printing the money and bidding away the labor and resources from us through the power of that printed money. And my point is that my objection to the Federal Reserve almost stops and starts with sheer rights under a free society, that government has no right to exploit us through the printing of money, because that's the most insidious theft of all. And that's why I call MMT modern monetary tyranny, and why it simply codifies the total corruption that we've suffered from with the Federal Reserve for over a century. But
just to expand on that point, because I agree with you 100%, and I think one of the things that keeps things somewhat in check is that if you have to pay for something, you have to actually make a decision about whether or not you want it. Yeah. If the government can just print the money for us to go to war tomorrow, then we never really have to have a conversation, hey, do I want to have this war? We never have to make the sacrifice for it. They just take it out the back end, which means that we're kind of removing that market element of having to pay for something, which that's the only way. Like, if you offer me tomorrow, hey, you want a brand new $5,000 bike? Yeah, of course I do. if I have to actually go pay for it, I got to make a decision about the other things I have to sacrifice in my life in order to go have it. So if government never has to ask us to pay for something, we're never using that market function of, do I actually want to pay for this, which is a pretty good way of making sure that you actually want it and that you're not just engaging in wasteful activities, or in this case, activities that just help one individual group. So that to me is one side of the Federal Reserve argument, is that government is robbing us of our wealth.
And that's a non-economic argument. That's precisely good. Yeah.
But the other side of it, which I think is of interest and is also important, is that it's actually not just government. At least government, when they're robbing us of our wealth, they can make the claim that these are investments that might benefit us. They can at least make that claim. You and I, you wouldn't agree with us, but you can make that claim. But when the private bankers are in on this scheme, and we're going to have to get into a little bit about how fractional reserve banking works and the relationship between the banks, the Fed, and government in terms of fractional reserve expansionary banking. But there's really no argument that you could put forward for why JP Morgan and the Rockefellers should be able to take part in this scheme where they get to profit. They're the only people who get to, or I mean, there are other banks in the system, but there's no reason why certain private individuals should be allowed to be engaged in this scheme where they get to inflate the money supply and profit off that process. Like, it would be one thing if it was an entirely national system. I still wouldn't agree with it. And I don't know that would be better for it, but at least you can make the argument that that's the way government works and it's representing the people. And then we could explore all the flaws of that. But to add on that you're going to have private bankers that are able to just profit off this scheme with the help of government, that's when you end up in the world of just insanity.
Well, just a moment. Okay. Here, I guess I'm going to steer the conversation, try to steer it in a slightly different direction, which is to say that, yes, you're right. The banksters have benefited. They are in league with the Federal Reserve. I have to say, Rob, that I regard that as less important than what I was going to get into as the second part of the story, which actually doesn't necessarily turn on the fractional reserve versus full reserve debate, which we of course have to mention. It's only this, which is that whether or not, I guess I'd put it another way for you, Rob. I'd say to you, Rob, well, now let's say government could arrange it so that the Rockefellers and the Morgans and all those banksters don't benefit. Would that be okay with you? Well, no, you said, well, it wouldn't be okay with me because, again, when government can just peremptorily print money, when Dick Cheney can say Reagan proved that deficits don't matter, what Dick Cheney, then Vice President of the United States, really meant was that deficits don't matter because we can always print the money. We don't have to worry. And indeed, that's the insanity that's going on right now. $3 trillion spent by government, and essentially it's going to be printed. They're going to pose some higher taxes on the rich. Yes, that's what they talk about. But by and large, it's going to come from printing. So that, I think, is inherently corrupt. And as a matter of fact, even John Maynard Keynes inveighed against it. But we've dealt with that, Rob. I wanted to deal with the next part of it, which is to say that it isn't so much that I need to make villains out of the banksters, even though they are villainously involved. It's really something that hopefully we can explain fairly simply, which is that we've mentioned why gold and silver become money. We've mentioned that one attribute of gold and silver is that it's very difficult to expand the supply of gold and silver so that it goes out of control. I mean, I shouldn't have said out of control. Expand it so that it increases, say, by 20% a year, 30% a year. Certainly today, and in the 19th century, or even going back, the amount of gold finds, even when they were booming, could not expand the supply of money by very much. And that's why then those precious metals provided a good base for the money supply. The key point, which most people can understand, is that price inflation then is kept under control. Because again, if goods are expanding by, let's say, 6%, but the money supply increases by 50%, then you're going to get very rapid price inflation, and that's going to be unstable. And other things will happen as well, which brings up the Austrian business cycle theory, which we'll get into. But the point is only that a relatively stable money supply is of great importance, and that's why gold and silver became the money of choice. And it will get us into Bitcoin as well. As you know, Bitcoin was set up so that there can never be more than 21 million units of Bitcoin. So stable supply, and in the Bitcoin case, taking it to an extreme where it's going to be flat supply, never increase at all in 21 million units. That's vital to the stability of money. And indeed, it's almost, when you talk about how did this all get invented, how did this come to be, if you want to get religious on us, somehow or other, God sent us gold and sent us silver, which works very well as money. But then he sent us Satoshi Nakamoto, who thought up a way to replicate the virtues of gold and silver in the crypto age. So that's very important. You want to say, because that sets the stage for the role of the Federal Reserve. But go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I think just one thing that I think is going to be important to set up here is that even within the gold and silver structure, banks started creating notes against the gold and silver, right? And then they started overexpanding the notes. So I think one of the things that just might be important to educate our listeners about is that with the fractional reserve banking system, you do have an expanding money supply where banks are incentivized, if they can, to the extent that they can, to expand the money supply. If they get, $100 in, they want to lend that money out. And I think what's just worth explaining is that there's some significant costs that are predictable and come to us based off of the fractional reserve banking system and the expanding money supply. The biggest ones are obviously being inflation, and that they do create a boom and bust cycle. So I'll hand that back to you, because I think that fits in a little bit with the Austrian business cycle theory, which I'm not really all that educated on. But I do think it's an important piece of the puzzle if we're looking at the issue of it, basically the Federal Reserve and a banking system that allows the banks to work together to inflate the banking, the money supply.
Okay, I see. Now I'm going to surprise you a little bit by saying that I'm going to be a little bit neutral on what you might be aware of as a classic debate between people like George Selgin and Larry White and the Rothbardians at Mises Institute. There are a lot of I guess my way of putting it would be to say that I would want to abolish the Federal Reserve. I want to make a transition to a free market in banking. And then I want to be open-minded about whether banks would, to some degree, practice fractional reserve banking. What Selgin and White argue is that where that happened, in other words, let me go over what you've just said, Rob. Do a Professor Bernstein on, because it's important for people to understand that that the complaint is that, well, you have let's say a billion units of gold, and that's money, but if the money is stored in banks, and by the way, the word bank, which is like put something by a riverbank, you're just banking it. You're putting it by the riverbank. You're putting it aside. You're for use, but for possible use. And then, of course, banks that get it, their warehouses, they get it, and then they might transact with you to make investments with it. But if there's an investment that they make with it, then in the according to the strict rules of the Misesians, the bank would say to you, Rob, well, you've got a lot of money with us. Can't we invest some of it? And we'll give you a bank CD. That means you can't redeem it right away, but we're going to invest it for you. We'll make some money on it, and we'll pay you a return. So that's how banking sort of arises, that people have gold and they put it in these warehouses, these banks, and the banks then become financial institutions and they engage in various activities. But according to you, Rob, if you've got a checking account that says that it's 1,000 ounces of gold for your use, then you want those 1,000 ounces to be there. That's the 100% backing of that gold. But of course, you might have another 1,000 or so ounces that you've lent to the bank. The bank will pay you some return, and the bank might have lent that money out. So that's all strict and above board, honest transactions. But then, as you indicate, Rob, if as commonly happens today, and did happen in the 19th century, if the bank decides to lend out some of that money it has in demand deposits, then it actually does not have that 1,000 ounces in the bank for you. It might have only 100 of it, and it might have lent out the other 900. and so if it does that, then it's actually increasing the money supply. And you're saying, well, that causes instability. I could get into it, but bear in mind one thing. Let's say that we have a situation in which we have fractional reserve banking, and it's 10 to 1. Instead of actually having a billion ounces out there, we've got 10 billion ounces in use. The point that's been made is that you can't expand very much from there, Rod. Another point that's been made by Selgin and White is that where you actually did have irresponsible fractional reserve banking, that's where you had government underwriting it. That historically, that you had government underwriting it. And the one point, I guess, maybe the only point to stress, I hope I haven't confused my audience too much. The only point to stress is that Selgin, White, and the Misesians, and hopefully Professor Bernstein and Gene Epstein, we all agree that the way to keep the money supply under control is through competitive banking. Because if there is a bank that irresponsibly starts to inflate, starts to pyramid, as you indicate, and leads the pack, gets very greedy and says, no, we're going to only have 1% backing. We're going to issue more and more loans out there, and for the demand deposits, there'll only be a 1% backing. Then those commitments are going to be registered with other banks, and the other banks are going to cause a run on the first bank that acts irresponsibly.
So
go ahead, yes?
I do, and I'm sure I'm just missing something here, but it sounds to me that at least Selgin's example, in my opinion, or my understanding, doesn't sound like it's the classical definition of fractional reserve banking. And what I mean by that is if I go to a bank and I give them $1,000 and I make an agreement with the bank that they can lend out 900 of that because, they're better at using money than I am. They might know that there's a mortgage that they can bundle that up with and that they can get their 4% return and they're going to cut me in at 1%. That's a pretty good and fair transaction.
Okay. Yeah.
That to me is not classical fractional reserve banking. Classical fractional reserve banking is I deposit the 1,000 and then they might deposit $900, somewhere else. And then all of a sudden we've expanded the money supply in a very big way.
Oh, yeah. No, Rob, thank you. That's what you said is exactly what I meant to say. I meant to say that I only meant to elaborate on the point that if you have the Misesian, I shouldn't say Misesian because people claim we don't know what Mises really thought. The Rothbardian view that all demand deposits should be 100% backed. But I only meant to point out precisely what you're indicating, which is that doesn't mean that banks can't act as financial intermediaries. Because, as you say, if you deposit a certain amount, 1,000 ounces with the bank will say, well, probably for your use, you only need about $100 or $500 in a demand deposits. Why don't we increase your return with us by lending out the other 500? In other words, that's what I meant to emphasize, which is that there's nothing in the 100% reserve requirement imposed by the Roth that indicates that a bank can't also be an investment institution because of what I said. Because obviously, you might use that bank to invest money for you, and you'll get a bank CD in return, just as you indicated. So that's not what's. So no, we all agree that is the Misesian, that's the Rothbardian way. And we all agree that the violation of fractional reserve banking occurs on the demand deposit level. That if you have 500 ounces of gold with the bank and a checking account against that 500, then if the bank then lends out 400 of it and practices and only has 100 backing on that 500 that you think you have with the bank, that's fractional reserve banking. Then it is indeed increasing the money supply in a way that offends the Rothbardians, but in a way that, at least according to Selgin and White, is not necessarily a violation of its fiduciary agreement. Let's say, well, that's what we do, and I'm only trying to say to you that it's an argument, it's a debate, which is interesting to have, but in a way less interesting than. Let me finish this point. I guess less interesting than something else, which is that all agree, White, Selgin, Rothbard, we all agree that in a free market, the way in which the dangerous expansion of the money supply can be controlled is through competition. That any banks that have the motivation to really lead the pack and inflate considerably are going to suffer runs on their holdings. And the runs, this is something, of course, that Rothbard especially pointed out. Other banks will cause the run. In other words, what if that bank lends out money and those loans, that the checks it writes get deposited in banks B, C, D, and E, and it's Bank A that's committing the expansion of the money supply, then B, C, D, and E will have a run on Bank A. And so the point is then that competitive banking is important, just like competition is important in every sphere in the economy. In banking, in order to keep banks honest, so that they don't overinflate, we need competition. We then say the solution is a monopoly imposed by government. That we're going to trust the government to oversee this and not to inflate, when every motivation of the government is to inflate, when what the government is actually doing is protecting banks that act irresponsibly against runs through the central bank. That's what the central bank does. It protects banks against runs when they overinflate. And the central bank has every reason to overinflate because it often wants to finance government's wars. When you said, by the way, the central bank is basically run by the private banksters, it is basically beholden to the government. The chairman of the Federal Reserve is appointed by the president. And the Federal Reserve has now got to pony up, has now got to print money in order to finance all the spending by the Biden administration. So therefore, the point then is that when we think abstractly, we need competitive banking in order to control the money supply. Now, the next part of it, interestingly enough, is that Selgin and White will argue that if we did have a free market in banking, you would have some fractional reserve banking. And they point out, and that in itself is an interesting debate. But where we all agree is that we need competition, and we need to understand that that the central bank was brought about in order to protect the banksters against the consequences of inflating, and in order to facilitate inflating on the part of the government. But go ahead, yeah.
Okay, so I agree 100% with what you said. I'm just going to sum it up and bring a question to you.
Professor Bernstein, yes. Yeah.
What we're saying is fractional reserve banking, let's not have that debate about whether or not that's an issue, because at least in a open and free market, the expansion of money is somewhat kept in check, that if a bank gets too aggressive, people will call on the bank and it will fold. The bigger issue,
it's not just it's other banks will have deposits. Other banks will most likely be the real vigilantes. But go ahead. Yeah.
Right. No. I think that is the most important part, is that when the banks start working together, right, where they're not demanding deposits on each other, we're looking at the ability of banks to inflate and expand in a much larger way than could possibly exist in a free market where they have to compete with each other.
It's a cartel organized by the central bank, by government.
So
Yeah.
just before we move on to the next point, I'd love a little bit more on. So once we're in this environment where banks have the ability to work together to expand credit, right? So aside from the fact that we can fund the wars, according to like the Austrian business cycle theory, why is that a cost to everybody? What are the negative consequences that come from this inflationary monetary scheme of every bank basically being able to work together to inflate the money supply?
Yeah. Well, in broad outlines, then we're talking about ABCT, the Austrian business cycle theory, and I guess one of the things I guess I would want to say to frame it at the outset would be that people often ask, is the inflation of the money supply and the effect on interest rates the only way we have economic collapse, booms and busts? Is it? Aren't there other ways? How are the Austrians insisting that this tends to be the only way booms and busts are caused? And the first answer to that is actually the Austrians never insisted on this. I wrote an article last April called "The Great Suppression," and that's the label I gave the recent economic downturn. And I began by quoting Murray Rothbard himself in his book on the Great Depression. Rothbard said that a bust can sometimes be brought about when the king goes crazy. And of course, what happened last April? The king went crazy. We had a Great Suppression. We simply decreed that firstly, all businesses got to ground to a halt. Only essential services can be provided. We've got to shut down 70% of the economy. And so that wasn't Austrian business cycle theory. That was simply the king going crazy, declaring that we can't operate anymore. It's a crime to operate a theater, a casino, a restaurant. And so you've got to shut down. So the government destroyed the economy, and we had a severe business downturn, which I called the Great Suppression. And as I said, according to Rothbard himself, who's an expert in Austrian business cycle theory, this was not a conventional Austrian business cycle theory. This was simply the king going crazy. And then the next thing, I guess, to put into the framework is to say that what we're observing when we look at an economic downturn is the convergence of bankruptcies. A lot of businesses are simply shutting down, going under. That's, of course, what happened when the government decreed the lockdowns. All these businesses shut down. And are there other ways for businesses to shut down? Well, you could invent a few ways. You could say, well, what would happen if everybody in the consumer economy decided to go kosher tomorrow? That we're not going to eat treif anymore, starting tomorrow morning. That would cause a wave of business bankruptcies right away. But when we think about that, and then we think about the transitions made in the market economy, we realize that most of them are not very severe. Most of the transitions are not very severe. Many of them are anticipated, and that shocks like the lockdown that I mentioned, the Great Suppression, shocks like all of us going kosher tomorrow, are unlikely in a market economy, and that since entrepreneurs are always forward-looking, many of them are going out of business, many of them are not. Usually, we do not get a convergence of bankruptcies, and so now that sets the stage for the next thing to grasp, which is how does the expansion of the money supply cause this kind of shock? I guess I should stipulate that you might say that there's such a thing as an oil shock. That let's say if the price of oil jumps, as it once did from it quadruples inside of a couple of months, that could cause some bankruptcies, that could cause difficulties. Usually they're dealt with. So what I'm trying to say is that in order to make it plausible for people, that basically a business downturn is is an unanticipated shock that happens in the economy. It's not something that happens very often. It did happen last year due to the lockdown, but where it happens for the most part is with the expansion of the money supply and with the effect on interest rates. And there too, it doesn't always happen. But what are we talking about in terms of the mechanism? What we are talking about, I guess, is really best exemplified by the downturn of 08 and 09. 2008 and 09, because that was.
I couldn't for 1 second on that point, because I just
Sure,
never thought about this on this terms. I'm wondering if essentially the market is pretty good at kind of making predictions about where to allocate capital. And when it's left to just the resources of the world, right, you don't have such sharp changes that all of a sudden things in the market get totally messed up.
Yeah.
But when you have things like expanding the money supply or interest rates, where you can have sudden changes because it's actually a man-made phenomenon, it's coming from government, it's coming from banks, you can end up with events that the market would not have predicted that will actually result in things like widespread bankruptcy or otherwise. In other words, you can have people thinking that, hey, look at this boom that's going on, look at all this money that's going to be available, and so they'll make certain business decisions or lifestyle decisions. But what they're not realizing is that the reason why there's all that money out there is that banks are just kind of fabricating it, they're creating it, and at some point they can't do that indefinitely. And so when you have contractions, it's going to be a man-made shock to the system that otherwise wouldn't exist. Like you were saying, the only real place that you see it with commodities is occasionally with oil. And I think the examples, by the way, if you were to look at them, are probably Jimmy Carter when he made some errors in terms of his, like, in other words, those are also probably more errors of government than they are kind of just, what's going on in the commodity markets.
Yes. Okay. Well, as a matter of fact, you have indeed in broad brushstrokes summarized the Austrian business cycle theory. It affects the interest rate. It makes certain allocations possible. But since you summarized it fairly well, you give me the opportunity to make another major point and concession, which is something I hear all the time when people are trying to grasp Austrian business cycle theory, which is, if it keeps happening, why doesn't business become aware of it? The only part that you left out a little bit when you talked about, the market economy is only that, again, entrepreneurs, people who are running businesses, are always looking to the future. You hear some of the wildest things when people say, "Oh, there's going to be a major recession coming because the population is getting older and they're not going to be buying the same things. They're not going to be playing tennis the way they used to. A lot of stuff is going to change." And usually the response is, "But don't you think that those people who run country clubs and tennis courts, most of them know that?" There are a lot of dummies. There are bankruptcies. But that's the whole point about the market economy, which is that most of these things are, for the most part, anticipated. So they're unlikely to cause a major convergence of bankruptcies. But that, again, gets into the next part of it. Since you've given a reasonable description of Austrian business cycle theory about interest rates getting low, malinvestment occurring, then you want to ask, but and skeptics constantly ask, but why doesn't business anticipate that also? Why do you make that a big exception? And actually, to some degree, there aren't perfect answers to that question. One of the simplest answers to that question is this, which is that if everybody listened to this podcast, Rob, all businessmen and all bankers listened to this podcast, or if everybody read Rothbard, then and if they recognized the dangers of what goes on when the money supply is expanded in this way, I do believe that the recessions would be milder. That there's been a lot of discussion about this. It is true, though, that if you are in an industry, and even if you know that a boom is occurring that's unsustainable, and that a bust will occur. It may be difficult for you not to participate in it to some degree, even if you're fully cognizant of Austrian business cycle theory. But I will tell you, just let me finish one point. I will tell you that during the housing boom, John Allison, who you may have heard of, who had read Austrian business cycle theory, and Charles Calomiris, who is a professor who was also running a bank. John Allison ran a major bank, BB&T. They both had a pretty fair idea that there was a housing bubble that was going to burst, and they both tried to their best to defend their banks against it and not participate in it. And so I'm getting, again.
But just another element I think people need to be aware of is that certainly since the last housing crisis, there's a perverse incentive to go bust. And if anything, we've somewhat extended that because, if you had a business in this downturn, you might have cashed out pretty good on PPE loans. You got an incentive to use the cheap money that's available to you, grow your business as much as you can. And if anything, if you hit a size where you're important enough to the economy, there's a good chance you're getting a bailout. So we're just not living in a totally free market where people are incentivized to look at the Fed and go, hey, I think there's certainly some people can see the profits and going, hey, I think there's going to be a bust coming. And the problem with being in that camp is that you're betting against the Fed because you don't really know what tools they might utilize in order to ensure that we're not in a bear market. But on the same note, if you're on the boom side, if you're an airline or you're certain critical industries, you're incentivized to keep growing because you kind of know that you got this backstop where the government's going to cut you a check to make sure your industry doesn't go under.
Well, right. Yeah. And okay. Yeah, no, you've pretty much answered it, Rob, but I'm only backing up. I'm trying to emphasize one point. When you deal with the skeptics keep saying that, well, you said that for the most part, the free market anticipates these changes, and you don't get a lot of converged bankruptcies. You get little problems, but not something major that you could really call a recession. Then again, the question arises, well, why is this one such a mystery? Why doesn't business anticipate this one?
Because the derivative markets are really difficult for anyone to understand, including the financial sector.
Derivative markets.
No. So I'm just saying when you're talking about an economic downturn now, I mean, even myself as a person who finds this interesting, it is really hard to quite understand the way that all of the world's capital has been allocated and the derivative products against that. Even the last downturn, your best brains on Wall Street didn't quite understand the way that they collateralized mortgage togethers and the tranches and what was going to happen.
Okay,
so I'm just saying the idea that your typical capitalist or a construction worker and that the way that the hive mind is supposed to work, where I can predict, look at the way people are spending money, is not wildly distorted by what the Fed is doing and the way that banks further expand. Like, we're already beyond fractional reserve banking. We're in a world of you see what I'm saying? So the idea that the idea that your average capitalist can make predictions in a system that is this screwy with this many really intricate financial products that can make major distortions for the entire system, that would be my argument back, is like, no, we're in loony world here. This is not the way that, the free hand is supposed to work, or your average capitalist is able to make, informed decisions.
Okay, Joshua, I think you made a better point earlier, Rob.
All right, fair enough.
But let me just make one point, Rob. The facts of the matter are that the BB&T Bank, as run by John Allison, fared pretty well when the housing bubble burst. Allison had to fend off people on the boards of directors who wanted him to lend money to things that he thought were unsustainable. But he was successful in doing that. So my point then is that however complicated all these things that you mentioned, I think that the first answer to all of those who ask the question, why is this such an exception? Why doesn't the free market, why don't businessmen anticipate this as well, just like they're anticipating other changes in the marketplace? The first answer is that most of them thought that Greenspan and Bernanke walked on water. Most businessmen are simply ignorant of Austrian business cycle theory. And so they don't have a full knowledge of these things as the knowledge that John Allison had. And so, for starters, the first answer to the point is that while a businessman can understand that the population is getting older, therefore their habits of consumption are going to change, and the markets, businesses are going to readjust accordingly. That's fairly straightforward. I guess alluding to your point about it, tranches and all the rest of it, it's a complicated mess. But I thought you made a better point earlier, which is that if you see your competition taking advantage of the boom, and then if you bear in mind that if you take advantage of the boom and take a little bit of undue risk, you might get bailed out. You bear in mind that if they get the jump on you and they take advantage of the boom, it might last a long time. Very difficult to predict when a boom is going to bust. So even if you are knowledgeable about Austrian business cycle theory, you might still have to participate. Gene Callahan made this point very well in a book called Economics for Real People. Very good discussion of Austrian business cycle theory and Austrianism in general. I'm only trying to be careful by trying to be sensitive to all of the doubts raised about Austrian business cycle theory. You made some good points, as I said, about this. Again, to revert to what the theory is and to apply it to the housing bubble, that was an odd case of Hidden in Plain Sight, which is a book written about what happened, which is that the government, in the person of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush especially, wanted to goose up home ownership. And they used the power of the Federal Reserve and the power, by the way, of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which operated like the Federal Reserve, to drive interest rates down and to make the home ownership rate rise. And they created they drove that's the interest rate going down, and that's a case in which malinvestment is being made in housing. Malinvestment on the supply side is being made in housing and on the purchase side, because housing is an investment that individuals make. And so that brought about an unsustainable housing bubble. Which was not difficult for me to perceive, but when I saw it, I had to admit I don't know when it's going to burst. So that's a problem. And then even when it did burst, it didn't initially bring the economy down. So that's another question about it. Will it bring the economy down or won't it? I believe that part of the reason why it had such an awful effect on the economy was the way the Federal Reserve mishandled the situation when the housing bubble did burst. I mentioned the housing bubble only because you'd think that that'd be fairly straightforward. You had a situation in which government, with the aid of the Federal Reserve, was driving interest rates down. The mortgage interest rate, of course, is the sensitive interest rate with which people buy houses. Then on top of that, there was pressure to malinvest even further by allowing people with no job and no credit to buy houses because of the zeal with which the government wanted people to buy homes. And then the housing bubble burst, the home ownership rate collapsed, and it brought down. It was enough of a convergence of bankruptcies to bring the economy down. Now, I mentioned that because I think it's the most obvious case of government intervention, a la Austrian business cycle theory, causing a recession. And then what is the solution? The solution on the part of the Austrians say, is, of course, to let the malinvestment work itself out. Don't create zombie companies. Don't sustain. As tragic as it is to see people lose their homes, what else are you going to do if they can't pay for those homes? As tragic as it is to see businesses on the supply side invest in building homes, what else are you going to do? Maintain them as zombie companies? We have to reallocate the economy in the direction of goods and services that are sustainable, and so that's the solution to the bust. So that's the way in which the government expansion of the money supply works on the economy. And let me backtrack and mention one point, that it works on the interest rate, that the Federal Reserve lowers the interest rate and lowers the cost of borrowing and causes different kinds of malinvestment, because the price of credit is the most important price of all in the economy. But by the way, there too, it doesn't always work quite as badly as one might think, because there are sometimes countervailing forces. If the Federal Reserve is expanding the money supply, then there might be a reaction on the part of the bond market to anticipate inflation and actually raise longer term interest rates. So a lot of that can happen too. So I'm only getting into some of the complications of it and saying that that it doesn't always cause a bust. It isn't always strong enough to cause a bust. But if we round up the usual suspects again to think about what causes instability, boom and bust in our economy, every once in a while the king goes crazy, as happened last year. Every once in a while there can be an oil shock. I don't even think the oil shocks of the 70s did a whole lot of harm, but that's conceivable too. It's a shock. But what else is the biggest shock? The biggest shock is when interest rates become low, malinvestment occurs, as in the case of housing, and then a bubble forms, the bubble bursts, and then that malinvestment has to work itself out. So that's the business cycle. It causes a lot of human misery, causes a lot of unemployment, and that's the other reason why we regard the central bank, the Federal Reserve, as part of the problem and not part of the solution.
Okay, so let's get into
now let's
that.
Get into Bitcoin. Now let's get into Bitcoin.
Oh, okay, perfect. I love it. I'm BTC for life.
You're what? Do you own Bitcoin?
I do. Not enough, but I own some, which makes me feel better about myself.
I actually buy gold and Bitcoin. I every month. We've done pretty well in Bitcoin, Rob. If we started buying last year, easily enough. The interesting part of Bitcoin, which of course initially befuddled me a bit, is that when you were talking about not having origins as a commodity, you could say that it didn't have its origins as a commodity. That in a way, it piggybacked on our knowledge about money, and by solving a basic problem. The basic problem is, how do you assure the market that this supply of money is going to be stable? And this gets back to a recent history when Friedrich Hayek, who won a Nobel Prize for contributing to Austrian business cycle theory, wrote a book in the 80s called The Denationalization of Money. He thought that he was in despair about government. We had double-digit inflation at the time. We had two major recessions in mid-70s and early 80s, and Hayek wrote a manifesto in which he said that we need the private sector to issue money, and he thought that we could encourage private sector firms to compete by creating a stable money. That Rob Bernstein would set up a firm in which he would issue money called Bernsteins, and he would get it off the ground. And I forget precisely how he'd get it off the ground. There must be ways. And then he would assure the market that he's not going to expand the number of Bernsteins beyond a reasonable amount, that he's going to be an honorable guy, and that if Bernstein doesn't do it well enough, then Epstein will do it. And this gets into sort of like some of the speculative and conjectural aspects of whether we trust private sector money, to what extent do we trust money at all? We trusted gold because gold was always stable. And gold was stable because of its God-given properties. This is what God did, not the private sector. Gold is expensive to mine. A lot of gold accumulates. It never wears out. And so it can't be expanded by very much. And so a lot of people responded to, Rothbard in particular responded to Hayek by saying, this is a crackpot idea. Nobody is going to trust the Bernsteins, Bernstein money, that is. Because even if you dominate, who's going to trust you to issue it, to make sure that you don't profit by issuing a lot of Bernsteins and enriching yourself? And so and then in fact, crypto money came out as well, which had the same problem. It was difficult to establish trust in people that whoever brings out the crypto is not going to be responsible and expand it beyond all reason. And so then what's his name? The Japanese guy who doesn't exist.
Satoshi Nakamoto.
Natasha. So he invents, his breakthrough is that he invents sort of the locked box concept. He says that this is Bitcoin, and no matter what anybody does, you don't have to trust me. You don't have to trust Rob Bernstein. There will never be any more than 21 million units of this currency around. So he replicates what God did for gold. And so that was the big breakthrough. And I guess by being by making us all aware of this, it was possible for Bitcoin to be recognized as money because it solved that problem. There are lots of people who play with the idea that, well, it was a commodity, really. It was a game. I don't know if I care too much about that analysis. Somebody set up a plan whereby he had 3 pizzas for sale. You remember the famous pizza pie purchase, and he sold the 3 pizzas for Bitcoin. And so that was the first big transaction, and they were the most expensive pizzas ever bought because apparently, they were bought for several Bitcoin, and Bitcoin is now at 70,000. But suddenly there was a breakthrough, and Bitcoin was being used as money. So it was a kind of and I should confess that I being mired in the regression theorem and all the rest of it, didn't initially see the genius of what Nakamoto had invented. The idea that independent of me, this is going to be a stable currency. And also, by the way, I was and remain a little bit bothered by the fact that Bitcoin is never going to be more than 21 million units. But I think that is manageable. In other words, in the case of gold, gold can naturally expand. It does have some potential to expand because there's a lot of gold in the ocean. By the way, eventually, if gold were money and it became really expensive, then it would be efficient, probably economically efficient to mine it from the sea. And so a lot of people have a little bit of a problem with the idea of reaching a point where the money supply never will expand. But I don't think—
What's the issue with that?
Well, it's an adjustment problem. It's this. I think I'll choose numbers that I'm comfortable with. I think that in a free market, goods and the total of goods and services can expand by about 7% a year. I think we can have a doubling of output every 10 years. 7% it translates into a doubling of output every 10 years. Okay, but if we have a stable money supply, then
built-in deflation.
Well, actually, that gets us into terminology that matters to me. I would like to call it price deflation. Deflation, to my mind, means a contraction in the money supply. Inflation means an increase in the money supply. But I use price deflation. It means that prices have to fall. It means that if you double, it means that if you have 21 million ounces of 21 million units, I should say, of Bitcoin, that if you're going to double output, then that means that all prices have to be cut in half. Although, by 7% a year. Now, I don't think that's too violent an adaptation to make. I think that if people understand it, then I think it can be made. But now think of the wage side, which is something that I know that George Selgin was very hung up on, and although he seems to have backed off about it of late. Selgin claims that if you have if you're going to double out, let's say that we do have an expanding labor supply, which is usual. In any economy, we have expanding population. So if the labor supply doubles in 20 years, that means then that in order to employ everybody on 21 million units of Bitcoin, that wages have to be 50% of what they used to be. It means that the actual nominal wage has to decline over time. But at the same time, of course, the real wage, the value of that wage is increasing because output is doubling every 10 years. The output is increasing much faster than the wage is declining. But you see there can be adjustment problems in that.
But it's almost the adjustment problem is just a function of the human psyche, in that if there's a fixed amount of Bitcoin, what that means is less and less Bitcoin will buy more and more stuff. So you might just currently have where I'm a little bit concerned, like, wait a second, I'm going to make less Bitcoin working the same job next month. But I think people would adjust pretty quickly to realizing, oh, this is very different than the way I grew up with money. And look, as long as, like, you know what I mean? I think people could wrap their heads around it pretty quickly.
Yeah. No, I think so too. And of course, obviously, it won't be the same people. Eventually, my kids, my grandkids, they'll get used to it, and then also, it will cause other interesting things to change. I had a bit of an argument with John Vallis, who runs a Bitcoin podcast, about the idea of store of value, which is a term you used earlier. Mises like to say that, obviously money is a medium of exchange, and you don't usually store value in money. You basically store value in stocks, bonds, or in my wife's art. You store it in assets that are going to appreciate in the modern economy. But interestingly, there could be a certain fetish about storing value in Bitcoin, because if Bitcoin is going to double in value every 10 years, then you have the ability to have assets appreciate in value simply by holding Bitcoin. So then it is a sort of store of value. However, I think that investors, entrepreneurs, and banks, all of whom are seeking your funds to lend out, they will compete. They will offer you an interest rate over and above that, which will lure you to invest in the usual way through stocks and bonds. But certainly it will change the ballgame a little bit, because it does mean that by leaving money in your mattress, it appreciates in value that way. So in that particular way, Bitcoin would become a store of value. And so I think that I do buy gold, I do buy Bitcoin. It has been, of course, rather interesting to observe that Bitcoin has increased by a multiple over the last 12 months, where gold has been pretty flat. And so I don't know where things are going. I mean, there are still a lot. Peter Schiff is not just the only one. A few others that I have some respect for, who think that gold is still the money of choice. Certainly, gold trades at a price that reflects its monetary value. If it were only traded for its ornamental and industrial use, it would be worth much less. So it still has a certain amount of money. At 1,900 an ounce, that's very pricey for just ornamental industrial use. That does reflect the idea that it is a precious monetary metal. So it's difficult for me to know what the future will bring, except to say that I do think that, given the way government is mishandling the situation, that easily, it's fairly easy to predict that 10 to 15 years, I sometimes say 10 years, now I'm saying 10 to 15 years down the pike, there could be a major fiscal crisis of the dollar. And if that's the case, if and when that does happen, there could be a real flight into Bitcoin. When people like Selgin and other monetary economists talk about the difficulties of making the transition to Bitcoin as money, or to gold as money, the one thing that they unfortunately leave out is that probably it's got to happen by virtue of a crisis in the dollar. It's got to happen tragically. It upsets me to say this, but it's not going to be some sort of orderly transition whereby a bunch of sage economists make a plan and we will make the transition. So, it's unfortunately going to be messy. And yeah.
I think that's a good transition, if you'll allow me, into there's just two other things from the book I think are important. for
Sure,
people to be aware of. And I think that this is a natural introduction for it. And I don't even think we need to spend that much time on it. But Rothbard does start off the book talking quite a bit about Gresham's law. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And it's another aspect of kind of inflationary banking schemes, which are predictably not going to work out. Gresham's law at its core just says that bad money chases out good money. The idea being that if government forces me to use some sort of a currency at an overvalued rate, everyone's going to want to try and spend that. They don't want to keep that. And so instantly, if you've got a better currency, that's going to start being stored and it's going to disappear, which creates certain financial problems. So I'll hand that back to you because it almost does seem to fall into the Bitcoin and gold thing a little bit as people want to move away from the bad currency, which is the US dollar, because you see what the overuse of it, and towards better currencies such as like a gold or a Bitcoin.
Yeah, well, that's why indeed it's driving. I hold on to my Bitcoin and to my gold, and I use the credit dollar. So the bad, I mean, I don't even like that formulation. The bad drives out the good. It's sort of like, I think it confuses people a little bit. We hold on to the good, and we spend the bad because that's
it's hot potato. You want to get rid of it.
Yeah. So for our personal advantage, we defend ourselves by doing that. And so obviously the term Gresham's law does apply in that particular case. Yeah. So what else were you going to mention? Yeah.
Okay. The last thing that I want to mention, I'll hand it back to you if there was anything else that you wanted to cover in regards to the book or Bitcoin or the Fed and the topic in general, is one of the interesting through lines in all of Rothbard's book. And this even exists in, I'm forgetting the title of it. What's this really small pamphlet, The Anatomy of the State?
Anatomy of the State.
Oh, yeah, that's what I'm thinking of. The Anatomy of the State.
Money. Yeah, go ahead.
One of his interesting through lines is he talks about the hijacking of the intellectual elite, and that there's a relationship between the money that government can pour into resources and essentially finding the right intellectuals to endorse their opinions in order to basically propagate the masses or make it seem like this is coming from the intellectual class and that these are good ideas. And so in this book, he explains quite a bit how every time they were trying to basically either create move the state banking over to national banking, or when Cook was selling all the bonds, or later when they created the Federal Reserve, a very important aspect in order to actually drive these policies forward is to have the intellectuals publishing the materials saying, hey, this would be a really good idea, and that they have the sales tactics where they're basically explaining, hey, this is good for everybody. But I don't know. To me, that's like a fundamental and important kind of through line for Rothbard, is showcasing how the fact that, certain forms of economics or, certain views within history might be popular might just be because of the fact that there's kind of government funds into that kind of, intellectual works.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, it sounds like you've summarized it fairly well, Rob. I mean, to now put a lengthy story on it, I came of age during the Vietnam War, and I read a book by Noam Chomsky. I heard his lectures and the book was called American Power and the New Mandarins. And he brought me up short in my 20s at the time, making me realize that the intellectuals, the professors at the universities, had a very powerful stake in furthering American imperialism, and that to the extent that they had any critiques of the Vietnam War, it was all from the standpoint of benefiting themselves from becoming agents of the state in furthering American imperialism. Of course, Professor Dr. Henry Kissinger, who became Secretary of State, was an exemplar of that kind of corruption. They wanted to help run the world, and as Chomsky surprised me by pointing out, because he was a socialist, that he said I would rather have Averell Harriman, a businessman / aristocrat, run the world. Averell Harriman thinks he has a right to run the world because his grandfather ran railroads, and the professors think they have a right to run the world because they're smart. But the problem with being smart is that when you're wrong, you get defensive, because then maybe you're not so smart at all, and maybe you have no right to run the world. But in Averell Harriman's case, if he's wrong, his grandfather still ran railroads, so he doesn't have to be defensive and difficult. He said, so Chomsky brought me up short by saying if it were a forced choice, he would prefer Averell Harriman. Now, of course, obviously, we have had Averell Harriman types and professor types all being quite interested in running the Federal Reserve for their own corrupt reasons. But clearly, if you're Alan Greenspan and you run a relatively successful / unsuccessful consulting firm, or if you're Bernanke and you're droning on as a sloppy ass professor teaching economics to graduate students, how can that compare with the heady excitement of running the Federal Reserve, of being one of the most powerful men in the world? I like the line of this guy Perkins, who worked in government. Anyway, he said they brandish at you the three most powerful drugs that the society has to offer: sex, money, and power. And it's clear that, Greenspan helped himself to all three of those drugs. And so that's what these guys do. And that's the nature of their corruption. And there are gradations of it. Obviously, Milton Friedman, who had mixed views, wasn't quite as corrupt as the rest of them. He had a certain incorruptibility. But by and large, the lure of working for government and having all that power is irresistible to these people. And so, therefore, it's actually remarkable that even occasionally these people do come up with some insights, because sometimes when they're honest, they have some interesting things to say. They are corrupted by power. That's the main problem with the mainstream economists, corrupted by the lure of power. And I got prepared when I studied economics. Chomsky prepared me to understand that John Maynard Keynes, who, by the way, most admired the Soviet Union and recommended his general theory, especially to the Nazis in the German edition. He said this works best under totalitarianism. He was the exemplar of that kind of economist / intellectual. Sit at the tables of power. It's a very exciting life. And so we can expect very little from these people. But we do find that there are a lot of people out there who are not corrupt. Professor Rob Bernstein, for starters, Gene Epstein as well, Mises, Rothbard, that tradition. And we do find there are a lot of fellow travelers, a lot of people at the Chicago School. There's a lot of wisdom out there. But I will say that it is rather comical to sometimes to examine what some of the mainstream are saying about Bitcoin, because it sort of surprised the heck out of them. They don't quite understand it. So we're not going to expect much from them. And unfortunately, only an economic upheaval is going to put gold and Bitcoin in its proper place as money, restore gold as money in its proper place to the extent that that's possible, or Bitcoin. I hope it's not going to be that severe or awful an upheaval. I hope that it's manageable. But clearly, the powers that be, the people who run the Federal Reserve, are not going to be of any help when that day comes.
All right. So before we call it an episode, was there anything else that you wanted to cover, or do you think I think we've given people a fair amount of education, but I know
an hour and a half, Rob. Come on. I mean, oh yeah, no. Well, I could throw in another little nugget. I think that you should, if you really want an interesting sort of nuts and bolts lesson on the harm that the Federal Reserve does, then actually it does come from George Selgin, whom I've been both endorsing and disagreeing with. Selgin at the Mises Institute. He delivered a talk summarizing a paper he'd done with two other economists, in which he did a very simple before and after about the Federal Reserve. He pointed out that the period prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913 was not exactly the way he'd run the money supply. It was filled with episodes of government intervention and problems. However, if you take the period from 1870 to 1913, it's a 43-year period prior to the creation of the Federal Reserve, and then take the period afterwards, and even forgive them the Great Depression, that even according to all of the so-called objectives of the Federal Reserve, price stability, the stability of business cycles, any way you measure it, the before and after will show you that with the creation of the Federal Reserve, everything got worse, even compared to the highly imperfect situation we had from 1870 to 1913. I regard that as a very, very nice sort of common sense lesson in economics. And it is so, of course, so contrary to the myths that kids learn in college that until the Federal Reserve, we had wildcat banking, we had mayhem in the money supply, and then
price elasticity.
What am I saying?
Price elasticity.
Price? What do you mean? What price elasticity meaning? What? What do you mean that?
Oh no, I'm sorry. Inelastic money supply. That's always like their big talking point. Is that without the Fed, we'll have an inelastic money supply.
Inelastic money. Well, yeah, no, actually, so that's interesting because you and we discussed that an inelastic money supply is indeed what Bitcoin is all about. 21 million units, and I think that if you think about it, it would probably be a better world even than gold, that it would provide a certain knowledge and stability that we could all live with, and it would restore capitalism to its true greatness. We'd have 7% growth every year. We'd have wages falling, but real wages rising. We'd have prosperity for all. We wouldn't have heaven on earth, but we'd certainly have a much better society than we have now. So I guess you and I ought to shut up, Rob, and hope that your audience enjoyed another session with Professor Rob Bernstein interviewing Gene Epstein.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Gene. Have a great Sunday.
You too. Bye-bye. Yeah.